Johannesburg is the economic hub of South Africa and Port Elizabeth the hub of automobile manufacturing. So this report does not come as a surprise to market watchers.
Johannesburg doesn't surprise me from an affordability point of view. It has probably the greatest density of housing and probably relative to the number of houses in the city, a much smaller proportion of really luxury homes compared to other cities like Cape Town, for example. And obviously Johannesburg being the financial and economic hub of the country, the earnings power and the salaries that are paid in Johannesburg are probably higher than any other city in the country rather. So Johannesburg doesn't surprise me. PE, I'm a little surprised by that number from an affordability point of view. But what it tells you in Port Elizabeth is not so much around where salaries are, but where property prices are, because I would expect Port Elizabeth to be way down the list in terms of competitiveness of salaries. But what it means is that relative to the rest of the country, their property prices are much lower. I think if you look then again at Port Elizabeth, Port Elizabeth is probably not one of the fastest growing cities. Obviously a lot of it is around the auto industry, and so I think what you're finding there is that property prices probably fell a lot harder than many other cities across the country, and those property prices haven't recovered, and nor salaries really recovering, and that's why PE from a living point of view relative to what you earn is very affordable.
Contributing factors are still economically driven.
There's different fundamentals behind both of those cities, which makes them possibly a much more attractive place to buy a property at the moment. For Johannesburg residents, the economy hasn't quite hit it as hard as Port Elizabeth, while Port Elizabeth has a very large sector of the economy focusing on manufacturing. So the manufacturing industry really hit the Port Elizabeth economy quite hard. And with property prices still lagging behind income prices, it is a lot more affordable currently to buy in Port Elizabeth on average. While in Johannesburg, the incomes are a lot more resilient to tough financial times, and the best income opportunities are still there. So you get a lot stronger income base from Johannesburg, with a lot more area to develop around that, making the property prices a little bit, or at least relatively, slightly cheaper than some other places in the country.
House prices in some cities have not come as a surprise.
Cape Town, a much smaller density of housing. Salaries are relatively low, but on average Cape Town is probably the most expensive city in which to buy a property at any size or any price level in the country. So you would expect Cape Town to be at the highest level, and Durban probably falls somewhere in between. Durban's got a mix of some very expensive areas like Umhlanga, for example, or the Berea, and that skews the figures.
In Cape Town, you've got a lot of constraints. You've got the coast, and you've got Table Mountain, which is right in the middle of your prime property areas, and there's very little land left to build on. So on average you'll get smaller properties which are a lot higher priced, and you can't build anything more if there's more demand coming that way. All you have to do is just push up the prices that are currently there.
This report was compiled combining affordable, middle and high-end houses in all cities.
I think that they take an average, and I think that's where Joburg becomes affordable, because Johannesburg is, for all intents and purposes, a mega city. So, there are houses that range from 250 to 300,000 right up to the 40 millions. But it's averaged out as a very affordable city just because the number of houses that are available below, for example, 1 million. Whereas, for example, PE, I think it's because there's a much smaller percentage of expensive houses, and you're dealing with a much smaller number of houses. So it's around volume of houses, the number of homes in the lower market, and then, as we discussed earlier, the issues of salaries. And Johannesburg, relative to the value of homes, salaries are much higher.
Though the bank's lending criteria has had a lot of relaxation, a lot still needs to be done to stimulate the housing market.
For the market in general, home loans it's still a very tough competitive environment. the household sector is highly indebted, so there's not a lot of capacity for the average home buyer to buy more property because they're already so highly indebted. From a mortgage advances perspective, the banks are also sort of restricted by what they can lend out. The National Credit Act put a lot of strain on what we can lend out to be a lot more responsible in the way that banks do their lending. But in general, the economic times that we've seen is far from over. Even though it's a low interest rate environment, there's still not enough stimulus or not enough available credit to buy new properties and to help the property market get back on its feet like it was a couple of years ago.